Okay, this is the Atlantic Slave Trade, Chapter 4, Section 3, one of the saddest chapters in the whole book.
Yes.
And this is about the transport of African slaves to the New World. The majority are going to go to the Caribbean, Brazil, and also the future area that becomes the United States.
The United States. It's going to be a tough time. Tens of millions end up coming through this area and, needing labor for sugar plantations, farms, and all to make money for the Europeans.
And it's going to be a huge profit for the Europeans. And slavery in this new world is going to last well into the middle of the 1800s.
Exactly. A
And for you
preview of U.S. history.
That's right.
Civil War.
For you Civil War buffs, what year did the Civil War end?
Anyone? I
That's
bet you're
right, 1865. Nicely done.
All right, so a little preview of what happened. For tens of thousands of years, we're talking about, even going back to cavemen. People needed to farm, people needed to do work, and there was always a need for labor. So we tend to think of slavery as something that happened during the Civil War in the United States, that it was only Africans who were enslaved. But this is historical, and so whether it was farming and labor, prisoners of war, they might have been used in work camps or just almost held as hostages until the war was over. Some people were enslaved for religious differences. I give the example in class of the Jews being enslaved by the Egyptians, different nationalities, and it all stemmed from this idea of the Europeans thinking that they were the center of the world, kind of like teenagers today, thinking everything revolves around them and, everything else doesn't matter. And that's sort of how the Europeans looked at it, that they were superior, they could read, they were educated, and that anyone else was sort of inferior and kind of uncivilized is how they sort of described it.
Well said.
Thank you very much.
So the causes of African slavery. Well, Europeans had many advantages over the Africans. Europeans were technologically superior, so they had muskets and cannons. And
They have cell phones yet?
Not quite.
Okay, not quite.
Okay, so the first slaves in the New World, as we talked about from Christopher Columbus's time, were the Native Americans. But when 90% of them died out from disease, a new source of slave labor was necessary.
We talked in the last chapter, or in the last section, 4.1, about, wanting to end the slavery of the natives. People were kind of against it because they had been there, the encomienda, and we needed more workers.
And the Native Americans didn't make the best slaves. One, the Native American men were not farmers,
Nope.
and so they were not very good at it. They were really good at getting away because it was their land.
So they knew where to go.
And Africans were better because it's a strange land to them, thousands of miles away, and they already had been exposed to European diseases, so they didn't die off as much as the Native Americans.
When the Portuguese were heading to India, they would stop along, those port cities in Africa and exposed the Africans to some of these Europeans' diseases. So.
Absolutely. And over 10 million slaves were imported by Spain and Portugal. And later on, the British are going to do a huge number as well.
So triangle trade, very simply, you see the triangle on the screen there, and there were many different triangles, but for the basics is that raw materials, sugar, coffee, tobacco, any goods that were from the New World, so Central America, what will be the United States, are going to be brought to Europe. It's in Europe where the manufacturing is, and they turn those goods into finished products, and then those finished products are either brought back to the Americas or brought to Africa to trade for slaves, and then the slaves are brought to the Americas. So it's kind of this endless cycle of products, people, and all essentially to make, a profit for those Europeans.
And each stop of the triangular trade was a profit for those
Exactly.
that were on the receiving end. So when slaves were brought over to the Indies, all the people organized with that make tremendous profit. In the colonies, profit is to be had. If it happens to go over to England or to Spain, everybody's making money, except, of course, the
For
Africans.
the African slaves.
One of the most harrowing journeys was the Middle Passage, and that was the journey from Africa to the New World.
So
And
think of the triangle, the middle line there, if you were drawing a
Absolutely.
triangle.
So you're on these dark, large ships. Many times these slaves were overpacked because the Europeans were looking to make as much profit as they can.
Yeah.
As you can see from this diagram, the slaves were literally inches from each other.
Exactly. And if you notice in the top one, even in the middle, if they could squeeze in one or two more in between, they would try to, get as many as they could. Because on the last slide, it said 20% of them died. So the more you had, the more chances you had of more surviving, which meant you eventually make more profit.
So just imagine weeks and weeks and weeks in a dark, dank area, 110 degrees, people throwing up and coming out the other end
Yeah,
too. And
going to the
it's
bathroom. And
all right next to you, and you have a very minimal amount of food just to keep you alive.
exactly.
And what happened when the slaves died? Where'd they go?
Somewhere in the boat, overboard. Yep.
Overboard.
I was even, some even tried to escape and jump overboard. They thought that maybe they could swim back or it wouldn't be that bad. Anything to try to get off the ship. And I tried to say to some of my students, picture 100 of us in our classroom. People maybe bring us a little food and water, but we couldn't leave for a couple weeks. And imagine how that would be if we couldn't leave the classroom. Stuck with your 100 favorite students. Sounds
And then
like
if you survive this journey, then now you're
Now
a
you're a
slave
slave, exactly.
for life.
Yep.
So, very awful. So, life in the Americas, slaves would be auctioned off to the highest bidder.
Yep. They would do checks, I think, teeth, make sure they were healthy. They wanted them to get the most for their money. They wanted them to live a long time.
So as a slave, you receive a minimal amount of food, enough to keep you alive.
Yep.
You're going to endure long hours, as much as they want you to make. And slavery is lifelong, and it's hereditary. So your children are slaves.
Their
and
children. Exactly.
But the slaves fought back, and they kept their musical traditions and their stories going, and their language, if they could, and their religion. If you've ever seen the series Roots with Kunta Kinte, which we'll talk about in class,
Yeah.
You'll know a little bit about that.
Trying to break him, take away his African culture, his name, and really, break down so he would do what they said. And by trying to keep those traditions and those stories, they tried to hold on to their past as long as they could, sort of keep them, more human. But it was really, really difficult.
It was. So what this all means, generations were lost in Africa. And when they go in to capture slaves, they're not looking for the elderly. They're
Yep.
looking for the strongest and the most able, and they're taking them from their families
Yeah.
and from their communities.
And a lot of times it was teenagers and, boys who, could be influenced, but who could still do the work and would hopefully, live a decent amount of time in the New World.
The Europeans played different tribes against each other. Approach a tribe, hey, we need slaves. You either can help us capture other slaves, or we're going to take you. So they're going to increase warfare among the African tribes.
By bringing guns into trading, some of those tribes may have settled their differences without violence, but now that they have a gun, it, made it more difficult to try to keep the peace.
African art, music, religion, food, culture will be now part of the New World in
Yeah.
North America, Central America, and South America. Like we talked about with the Native Americans and the Spanish, and new peoples being born, we'll also have new peoples here in America between Europeans and Africans.
I think some rock and roll has a little bit of African origins, like the drum beats and that sound.
Absolutely. Okay, so we'll talk more about slavery in section 4.
Mr. Parnas, please don't interrupt again.
Hate Mr. Parnas.